Hello everybody. So in the last videos we looked at ELCC Standard 1, which talked about a principle of building leader, developing, implementing, and stewarding a vision and mission for the school. And in doing so we looked at planning as one aspect of that to see how plans aligned with the vision and mission of schools and those kinds of activities. So now we're going to move to Standard 2, and you can see here in Standard 2, we have it up here, and there are 4 areas under Standard 2. Standard 2 says the candidates who complete the program, those are you, ed leadership candidates, are educational leaders who have the knowledge and ability to 1. Promote the success of all students by promoting a positive school culture. 2. Providing an effective educational program. 3. Applying best practices to student learning. And 4. Designing a comprehensive professional growth plans for staff. So you can see how these all interact, and hopefully by the end of our course what you're going to see is that all the standards interact with each other, and that as you start getting these things in mind as an effective leader, what's going to happen is you'll see your school become an effective school. Now, one of the big things that we're going to concentrate for a few weeks here really deals with curriculum, because after all, that is what we do. We have students, we have communities. In many of our communities here in Oklahoma, especially in the rural areas, the district is probably the largest employer in the city or in the community. And our job evolves around the curriculum. What we teach, how we teach it, what the students learn, all that kind of stuff. And then based upon that, we're going to see that these other things come into play: the school culture, the student learning, and especially professional development for staff. So it is all connected, and in the bigger picture, this standard is connected to all the other standards as well. But that connecting piece here that I really want you to see is really the curriculum. If we have the curriculum established and an effective curriculum, these other things are going to be able to be dealt with in an effective manner. If we have an ineffective curriculum, then we can do all the professional development we want, but if teachers are following the curriculum, it's not going to end well. The end product is still going to be students not learning. Or if we don't take into consideration student learning, we can take student learning into consideration, but if we're not teaching them a well-established curriculum, they're going to learn what we teach them, but it's not going to be what they need to learn. So the curriculum is going to be the central focal point on a lot of other things, and you'll see how everything leads back to the curriculum. So with that, I want to give you just a brief history of education vis-a-vis curriculum and schools. Okay, and so I'm not going to read all these slides. There are a lot of words on these slides. You have a copy of these slides. I just want to point out the highlights of how we got to where we are today in the first part of the 21st century. So how did schooling in the U.S. evolve? How has that shaped the curriculum? And how has that shaped educational access? So these things are the big picture items that we're going to take a very cursory look at. So in the 1600s, pre-U.S., obviously this is pre-United States, historically education was a two-tiered system, and basically the wealthy were the ones who were educated. The poor did not attend school. They typically would attend an apprenticeship and learn a trade, if anything at all. In 1647, we see one of the first laws passed dealing with education, and this is in Massachusetts, the Deluder-Satan Act. And what this law did, 1647, okay, so 350 years ago, said that when the town got to 50 households, they would have an instructor, somebody to basically tutor the students on reading and writing. When the town got to 100 households, they would actually develop a grammar school, and that instructor would then go and teach, quote unquote, at the grammar school. So we see the beginnings of an education system in the United States. Notice that there's no compulsory attendance with this. It's simply setting up schools to educate the population. In 1776, in a report to the Virginia legislature, Thomas Jefferson called for a public school system. He said that the purpose was to develop an intelligent citizenry and to provide educational opportunities that guarantee each individual the chance for optimal development. That sounds very good, like what we have today. And in 1776, this idea was turned down, okay, in Virginia, of course. So let's look at elementary schools specifically. Elementary schools were first established in 1818, public elementary schools. Until the 1840s, it was highly localized and still only catered to wealthy people. There's no compulsory attendance, and so typically we saw the wealthy people who were able to go to school. By 1850, 45% of children attended school, and a direct tax to support was generally an accepted practice. And so we start to see the beginnings of a tax system that supports public education. Massachusetts, again, taking the lead, passing the first compulsory school attendance law in 1852, followed by New York the year after. And by 1918, all states had passed laws requiring children to attend at least elementary school. And if you have taken legal, you saw that, of course, 1907, Oklahoma became a state, and we had that same law as well. We had a very relaxed compulsory attendance law, but it was there. I think the children had to attend between the ages of 9 and 16 or something like that for 3 months a year. So very relaxed, but it was there, so we start to see a focus on education in the early 20th century. The South in general, though, developed a little bit differently than the North, and if you remember your American history, this was because of the agriculture system in the South, and it really isolated, so we didn't see large urban areas grow up like we saw in the North. And as a result, the plantation system really took over, and this is what helped guide education. And so education was much more of a personal thing, and again, left mainly to the wealthy. And those who were not wealthy did not attend public schools like they did in the North. And as a result, this tended to as a quote here, the condition tended to retard the growth of a strong middle class, with which free public school systems always originate in the South. While the concept of public education gained momentum and popularity, what was taught in schools and who would attend them was heavily debated starting in the 1820s. The question was, would there be a common public school system with a common curriculum for rich and poor? And so this was the debate in the 1820s. And so I want to frame this now that, we're looking 200 years ahead, and our debate today is reaching all students, disregarding differences in ethnicity and race and gender identity, socioeconomic status, language acquisition levels, special ed classifications or gifted classifications. We're looking to educate all students, whereas in the 1820s, 200 years ago, the question was, would the rich students and the poor students have the same curriculum? Would they need to be taught the same thing? The concern here, obviously, if that were to come to fruition, that public education would ultimately become a system attended by poor kids, and the wealthy kids would attend private schools, and there would be two separate education systems in the United States. And people began arguing against this. And you can see in the late 1800s here, starting with Ward, and then Parker, and then finally Dewey. Ward stated in 1883, unless the curriculum fostered the development of intelligence, education could not be a means of social reform. So it's also important to keep in mind what's happening in the late 1800s. This is the Gilded Age. It's a very unequal society, so it's no surprise that we see a renewed emphasis on who are we going to educate in public schools and what is the purpose of public schools. And so it's no surprise then that Ward would come up with a statement talking about social reform through public education. Parker built on this thought, writing the most important, or more important even than the formalized curriculum, was Social Power of School, to break down the clannishness and prejudices of people from all parts of the world who were learning together in school. And then, of course, John Dewey echoes these by saying educational opportunity is shared knowledge, and concerns and progress is achieved through breaking the class barriers to sharing. Thus, the problem was one of learning together as well as what is to be learned. So I asked this question, have these debates been solved today? And I think that's an interesting question to look back and see that this was about 120, 140 years ago. These debates were going on for the purpose of schools and what schools achieved. And you will see that this will influence how we look at curriculum today. Okay, what it is that we are wanting students to learn today through our curriculum is shaped by these debates from 140, 120 years ago. And I would contend that we're still having very similar debates. The first textbook on curriculum. So now we're going to move to curriculum. So what is it that we actually teach students? So by the early 1900s, we see that we have compulsory education laws in most of the country. What are we going to teach them now that we have them in school? And so John Franklin Bobbitt wrote the first curriculum book in 1918. Curriculum is an arena of social engineering. The assumption here was that scientific experts are qualified and justified in designing curricula based on expert knowledge of what qualities are desirable in adult members of society, and then it can be known what experiences would produce those qualities. Thus, curriculum is defined as the experience that someone ought to have in order to become the kind of adult they ought to become. Curriculum is an ideal rather than reality of what will actually happen. So I want you to take that concept from 1918. This is literally 100 years ago. And see what he's saying here, that curriculum is justified by the experts, the scientific experts, who in their fields know what it takes to be a desirable adult member of society, and these are the people who we should rely upon to tell us what should be taught in schools. So then I asked the question, do you agree with Bobbitt, and how do his writings influence curriculum today? Well, obviously you can see there's a lot of influence, but by the time we finish this presentation, hopefully you're going to understand that what we built on from 100 years ago with Bobbitt has grown tremendously, and we have a different outlook on curriculum with some of his ideas as the basic foundation. Okay. So just a quick slide on secondary schools. We see the first secondary public school opening in Massachusetts in 1635. Again, Massachusetts is taking the lead here. 1751, Benjamin Franklin opens the American Academy in Philadelphia. More of what we would view as a trade school. By the late 1800s, again, this is when Ward and Parker and Dewey are writing. The National Education Association Committee of 10, purpose of American high schools debated: college preparatory or a people's school offering a range of practical courses. So now that we have schools and they're going, again, it's getting to a curriculum issue. Establishment of a standard curriculum and liberalizing high school by offering alternatives to Latin and Greek. So that classic education that you would see in Boston would typically require you to take what we would consider a very liberal arts education. In a lot of ways, you would study history, you would study literature, you would probably study a foreign language, and you would study classics. You would study either Latin and or Greek. So the question by the late 1800s is this still an appropriate curriculum? And so we start really concentrating at this time. Again, this is during the late Gilded Age, at the beginning of the Progressive Era. We really start concentrating on what is the goal of school in society in general, and at this point is contributing to the student's own well-being in society is good, and to prepare some students to go to college. From 1900 to 1996, the percentage of teenagers who graduated from high school increased from about 6% to 85%. In fact, in the 1920s and 30s, progressive education was the word of the day. The focus then shifted to intellectual discipline and curriculum development projects in the later decade. So you can see how we moved from over 250 years from the middle of the 17th century to almost the middle of the 20th century, so almost 300 years, where we go from educating wealthy, apprenticizing the poor, those who are lucky enough to become an apprentice, to establishing schools, to debating the purpose of education. And then ultimately, when we start getting into the 20th century, we're starting to solve that question of the purpose of education. But then the question is going to turn back to curriculum again. And if the purpose of education is to produce citizens, competent citizens, then how are we going to do that? And that is a curriculum issue. And the last slide here on history, post-secondary schools, again, we go to Massachusetts. Harvard was the first university in the United States, established in 1636. By the 20th century, we see participation in higher education or post-secondary schools increasing tremendously as the 20th century progresses. At the beginning of the 20th century, at 1900, about 2% of Americans 18 to 24 were enrolled in college. In the late 1990s, more than 60% were enrolled, or over 14 million students in 3,500 four-year and two-year colleges. So we see the shift in education historically, and so now what I want to do is for the next part is look at some models of curriculum, okay? So if we decide that everybody is going to go to school, what do K-12 schools teach? If we're going to produce citizens, then what do we need them to learn? And so we're going to look at what we would call some models of curriculum. And this gets a little bit detailed, so just bear with me. You have this PowerPoint. You can look and think about it and reflect on it later. And then finally, we're going to conclude with what the principal's role is in developing a school's curriculum. And we're going to come back to that statement I said earlier about the experts in the field. So let's take a look at our first classic model of curriculum. This is the Tyler model, and I've made some crude copies out of the textbook here that I will show you. This is often referred to as objective model. State the objective. Emphasis on consistency among objectives, learning experiences, and outcomes. And curriculum objectives indicate the behavior to develop and or content to be applied. So let's look at this model. And you can see here in the beginning, our objectives come from three things. The subject matter, society in general, and the learners themselves. And then we have some tentative objectives. According to Tyler, these objectives would then go through some screening processes. What's the philosophy of the school, the psychology of the students and those involved. And we would come up with some final objectives. These would be presented to the students in a learning experience, and then an evaluation of whether or not the objectives work, and we would go back. So that in and of itself, on the surface, without looking at anything else, sounds very plausible and straightforward, okay? But what we're going to see is this is actually just one of the first models of curriculum that was really developed. And as time goes on, these are going to change and be more receptive of the demands that student learners need. Okay, so on the surface, the Tyler model looks to me like it's going to work, okay, and be just fine, and we could apply it to any school today. So let's look. He has 4 guiding principles. Define the appropriate learning objective for the student. Establish useful learning experiences. And there's a lot of discussion on what learning experiences mean. This, of course, this is contemporary with John Dewey. And so learning experiences here is going to evolve, but today you think of learning experiences as how do students interact with the content, okay? That's an easy way to describe what a learning experience is how do students interact with the content. We'll come back to that concept or that idea. Principle number 3, organize learning experience to have a maximum cumulative effect. Year after year, lesson after lesson, grade after grade, and so forth. And then finally, evaluate the curriculum and revise those aspects that did not prove to be effective. So there were some criticisms of this model, though, okay? One of them was that the learning objectives are too narrow in their scope, difficult and time-consuming constructing the behavioral objectives, curriculum restricted to a constricted range of student skills and knowledge, and critical thinking, problem solving, and the value acquiring processes cannot be plainly declared in behavioral objectives. So on the surface, it sounded like that was a pretty straightforward way to go, but you can see there are some criticisms there. When we create that objective, what are we looking for in that objective, and how does it determine what the students are going to learn and how they're going to learn it? None of that's in there. And so these are things that later models will improve upon. So as we're going through these models, I want you to think about how your site, and probably more specifically your district, approaches curriculum. Do you even have objectives that you use? And I will say at this point that in my work with districts around the country on curriculum issues, what I mostly see are students who say the state standards are their, or not students, teachers who say the state standards are their curriculum. And that's problematic, okay? Because at that point, you really don't even have objectives. But just keep this in mind as we go through and look at these various models. So some strengths that were in Tyler's model that will come out similarly in subsequent models. Clearly stated objectives are a good place to begin. Involves active participation of the learner. I don't know that that piece was translated in the learning experiences on how the student interacts with the content. Tyler may have intended it for it to be an active participation. I would venture to say that most student interactions with content today are inactive participations or passive participations. In other words, they don't actually interact with the content. They hear it, they may read it, they do a worksheet to regurgitate the basic facts of it, and they move on to the next level. Okay. So I want you to pay attention to that idea of active and passive participation with the content. But in the model, the main focus was that there would be an active participation. And the last strength here is it's a linear approach to development of behavioral objectives. So Beauchamp took Tyler's model and improved it, and this is what we call the managerial model. The curriculum is an actual written document. These are the rules. It contains statement outlining the goals for the school for which the curriculum was designed. Contains a body of culture, content, or subject matter that tentatively has the potential for realization of the school's goals. And so we see bringing in the culture here. This is in addition to what Tyler did. Contains a statement of intention for use of the document to guide and direct the planning of instructional strategies. So we see Beauchamp asking for an actual written document, and we see that statement of intention on how it's going to be used. And then it contains an evaluation scheme. And so if we look at his model, you can see that this evaluation scheme, the rules for use, this is the written document, the goals of the curriculum, the culture, all these things are woven throughout the curriculum. His idea was that it would be for specific areas. So he said there should be languages, communication, health, PE, fine arts, natural science, social science, and math. And notice that he wants to see the cognitive, affective, and inquiry skill components in each of these. So you can see we're getting much more detailed in Beauchamp's model than we did in Tyler's model. And then the level of school organization is the different levels within the organization. So number one may be a classroom, what these three components would look like in each of these classes within a classroom, considering these outside forces. Number two might be a building. Number three might be, the district as a whole, or central office. And then number four might be the district as a whole. Okay, so we're looking at it through different levels of the organization. So you can see this is a much more detailed approach to curriculum. The Taba model is the next one that we're going to look at. And she really came up with the learning experiences and looking at objectives, okay? And you can see the interaction here, the theoretical framework, the aims, goals, and objectives, the learning activities, the evaluation, and the content or the subject matter. And all of these things interact with each other throughout the development of the curriculum. She stressed the importance of learning experiences. She stressed vertical organization, or the sequence of continuity and information. In other words, what we would call that today is vertical articulation from one grade level to the next. And she addressed horizontal organization of the scope and integration of the subjects. Horizontal integration is what we would refer to that today. And we're looking at two things here. Number one, horizontal integration in and of itself is simply, are all the English 1 classrooms basically teaching the same thing to English 1 students all across the district, whether it's in one building or 20 buildings. That's the biggest spot for horizontal coordination. The second thing that Taba stresses here is the integration of content. So in other words, just because we're teaching social studies doesn't mean we can't bring in literature or fine arts or maybe even some of the hard sciences. Okay, the content for each subject would be contained within units, and each unit consisted of key concepts, main ideas, and specific facts. So she organized the curriculum around these key units that would be taught at each grade level, with an emphasis on the learning experiences used to teach them, and that vertical articulation and horizontal coordination. Okay, so you can see that she took it a step further by adding in those key aspects of vertical and horizontal pieces, and then concentrating on the learning experiences of the students. So consider the traditional concepts of these three models that we've seen: the Tyler, the Beauchamp, and the Taba. Which of these most closely align with yourself, and why? In other words, which of these do you think might be the best fit in where your thinking is right now as far as curriculum? And why do you think that? What different visions and goals would emerge from each of these models? And so you can go back and think of them, and you can see how they built upon each other, and that by the time you get to the Taba model, you really are seeing the stress on that vertical and horizontal articulation and coordination. Now let's look at some more modern curriculum models and what they look like. So first of all, most of these have an emphasis on interdisciplinary courses, open-ended systems, intergenerational and interprofessional relationships, Socratic dialogues, multidimensional assessments, and multiculturalism. Most are open educational systems, and consider the above statements in the following late 20th century definitions. Consider them in late 20th century definitions. So we're going to see how we built upon what Tyler, Beauchamp, and Taba did, and move into some modern systems. So in order to do that, I want to give you just a few definitions of curriculum. In the curriculum development course, the first thing I start off with is, what does curriculum mean? But here are a few definitions for us, okay? Eisner in 1985 said the curriculum of a school or a course or a classroom can be conceived as a series of planned events that are intended to have educational consequences for one or more students. Okay? Miller and Seller, curriculum is an explicitly and implicitly intentional set of interactions designed to facilitate learning and development and to impose meaning on experience. As we look at these definitions, I want you to think, does your school have a curriculum? Or is your school simply teaching the students what's in the textbook? Okay? And if you're a one-to-one school and you're using online resources, do these definitions define what you're using, or are you simply using technology to find information that explains a content area? Okay? So here we can see that Miller and Seller say curriculum is an explicitly and implicitly intentional set of interactions designed to facilitate learning and development and to impose meaning on experience. Very powerful statement. Curre is derived from the Latin infinitive verb that means to run the race course. Curriculum is a verb, an activity, or for William Piner, an inward journey. The modern curriculum development rationale has truncated the etymological meaning and reduced curriculum to a noun, the race course itself. Thus, generations of educators have been schooled to believe that the curriculum is a tangible object, the lesson plans we implement, or the course guides we follow, rather than the process of running the race. So what are the implications if we think of curriculum not as a noun, the tangible objects that we use in our day-to-day lessons in class, but what if we thought of it as a verb? Further stating a quote from Piner, curriculum understood as symbolic representation refers to those institutional and discursive practices, structures, images, and experiences that can be identified and analyzed in various ways, i.e. politically, racially, autobiographically, phenomenologically, theologically, internationally, and in terms of gender and deconstruction. So that is bringing a whole lot into what Piner, Reynolds, and Slattery and Tubman see as curriculum. A couple of more. Oliva in 2001, a plan or program for all the experiences that the leader encounters under the direction of the school. The curriculum, as we use the term in this book, refers not only to the official list of courses offered by the school, we call that the official curriculum, but also to the purposes, content, activities, and organization of the educational program actually created in schools by teachers, students, and administrators. So look at that all-encompassing definition there of what curriculum means. Curriculum development is a process whereby the choices of designing a learning experience for students are made, and then activities through a set of coordinated activities, and then activated through a set of coordinated activities. Curriculum has the following four components: objectives, content, experiences, and evaluation means. Instructions refers only to experiences. And here that's kind of harking back to Tyler. And the last one, curriculum is the central focus of the school as it entails accountability for all that each student is, all each student brings to the learning situation, and all knowledge, skills, and dispositions that are planned, imparted, or facilitated via the instructional process. So you can see by the time we get to this last definition of curriculum, we really have a very broad idea of what curriculum means in a school. So putting all these together in a very modern idea of what curriculum is, we can look at the Irby-Lundberg model of curriculum compared to those previous three that we saw. According to Irby and Lundberg, curriculum must be led by the principal, but developed collaboratively, considerate of the community, responsive to student needs, connected to vision and mission of the school, reflective of the needs of a global society, able to be assessed in terms of student performance, and integrated systematically. And here's a pictorial definition of the Irby and Lundberg model. And you can see they take all of these variables into what they term as curriculum. Another modern example would be the Ornstein model. And within this, there are 7 categories to this model: the political forces, the knowledge industry, the external groups, the content, the instructional activities, evaluation, and supervision. So let's look at this model. We're starting to get much more broad. The political forces, these are at the different levels that go into this box here, and all this is shaped by the knowledge industry. These are your professionals. These would be those scientific experts. building in the specialists and their input. We get into external groups, professional associations, college requirements. What do colleges require? If we're preparing students to be successful at college, then do they need to, if they're going to take the ACT, that obviously has an influence on our curriculum. Textbooks, here's where your state standards would come in. Okay, and so and then all this comes into content, and under here we have knowledge, skills, concepts, research methods, ideas, and values. These are put into the instructional activities. This is what happens in the classroom, and then an evaluation, then over all these last three areas, we have the supervision of the curriculum done by the principal. So you can see in this model, which is a somewhat detailed model, that when somebody says, oh, our state standards are our curriculum, that is taking this one line here out of this whole model and saying that's the curriculum. Okay, so you can see why the state standards are just one tiny part of what an overall effective curriculum looks like. The last model I believe here is the Eisner model. This is a little bit more, a little bit more, less programmatic maybe. The 5 dimensions needed for successful schools are the attentional, the structural, the curriculum, pedagogical, and the evaluative. And here we see in the Eisner model that all of these things are evolved in developing the curriculum. So whereas we see a procedural process in things like the Tyler or the Beauchamp or the other two models that we looked at here, in the Taba and Eisner models we see just broad ideas around what constitutes the curriculum in the school and the interaction between those ideas. So now let's switch, and here at the end of the presentation, let's talk about the role of the principal. So the principal is the one who needs to develop, at least in the building, if not at the district, it would be better at the district, a curriculum plan. Okay. The functions of a curriculum plan is that the plan produces a curriculum for identifiable population. It explains how to implement the curriculum in a specific school, and it appraises the effectiveness of the curriculum development. One of the things that I look for when I go work with schools is I want to see a curriculum plan in place. And if not, we give them some detailed explanations on how to develop an effective curriculum plan that will do these things and much, much more. Okay. So now, what's the role of the principal then? Okay, so here we see the principal is the one who really needs to effectively help get together the community to determine what the curriculum is going to be. So the curriculum is more than just the standards. It's the community, it's the values of the students, it's the culture of the school and of the community. It's obviously the standards, it's the material to be used like a textbook, but beyond that, it's more than that. It's how students are going to learn. What learning experiences are the students going to have? In other words, how are they going to interact with the content? And then above all, how do we determine if what we're doing is making an impact? And if not, then how do we build upon it to make it better? Or how do we alter it to make it better? All those things are what the principal is going to come in and do as the curriculum leader in the school. So these two bullets here, the principal does not need to provide all of the curriculum leadership. The most effective ones collect information and use it to facilitate curriculum development. And on the next one, we're going to look at what type of information a principal needs to bring to get adequate curriculum development. The principal is the curriculum instructional leader. In order to share the responsibility for curriculum leadership, The principal must allow teachers to take responsibility for the curriculum, arrange the schedule to give teachers time to work on curriculum, provide staff development, provide resources, and create a community of learners. And later on, this is where you're going to start seeing that all of those ELCC standards really come together, and their central focus is going to be on that curriculum. And if our curriculum in Standard 2 is aligned with the vision and mission statement that Standard 1 talks about, then you will have a successful school. So part of what the principal is going to do is to help create curriculum goals and instructional objectives. And we'll look at what those two things are. They're different, but in order to achieve this, the principal has to get teacher and staff buy-in. And so how do you do this? This is what I said we'd talk about, the things that the principal would bring here, where it says collect information. What information? Number one, data that support the need for change. Number two, information that supports changes in a similar context. What are surrounding districts doing? What are similar schools in other states doing? Connection between goals and achievement measures. How are you going to measure your progress toward your goal? Okay. Focus on usability, simplicity, and effectiveness. I've seen schools that don't have a curriculum. I've seen schools that have curriculum that is so detailed that it becomes too cumbersome and teachers simply don't use it. Okay, so kind of two ends of that spectrum there. Clear relationship between changes and the vision of the school, and then finally, but certainly not the least important, is opportunities for teachers and staff to participate in goal and objective creation. So what are the differences there then? Your curriculum goals are broad general statements to help develop programs. What you want students to do, that would be a curriculum goal. An instructional objective, the required performance conditions for behavior and level of performance, what the student actually does. So here you would say that given 20 sentences with grammatical errors covering so many types of things, students will identify the grammatical errors at 80% proficiency. Okay, that's an instructional objective. Okay, that's stating the performance, the conditions, and the level of performance expected. A little bit more information. We talk about objectives. This is really getting into what we would call deep alignment of the curriculum. It's when our curriculum goals and instructional objectives are, we really look at the cognitive aspect, and this is your Bloom's taxonomy. This is not the revised Bloom's. I need to update this and put the revised Bloom's, because that's what I use in schools mostly now, are the revised Bloom's. But looking at the cognitive level that's happening in your classrooms, and the cognitive level that is on state assessments. That's typically the main source of evaluation we use, but it's not the only source. And make sure there's an alignment there. Other types of classifications for objectives would include effective. What are some things that we want students to learn, such as values and things like that, character. And then finally, psychomotor skills. Okay, these kinesthetic things. How are students learning that as they're a part of their curriculum? Objectives must correlate with the curriculum. So all these need to go back to the curriculum. So how do you do this? Last 3 slides here. You as a district, or as the principal of your building, in reality you would want to get the district involved. You develop a needs assessment. Okay? And needs assessment assists with the developing or revising your curriculum, ensures the dynamic and responsive curriculum, and it gives teachers information about learners. So what's in a needs assessment. These are some basic things. You would review an analysis of your standards. Anybody who has worked with state standards knows that these are just guiding tools. They're not meant, in general, they build upon each other, but there are things that are missing. And so you need to get a good analysis of the standards and how they spiral from one grade level to the next, and understand your standards. Review curriculum from successful districts. Interview students, teachers, and parents. What do they expect in the curriculum? What did they see in the current curriculum? Review their work. We talked about those levels of cognition primarily. Is that reflected in the students' work? What are the students being asked to do? Keep in mind a phrase that task predicts performance. If the students are taught this enormous lesson on American history, and then they're given a word find with key words, the task predicts the performance. That word find is not measuring whether or not they understood this great lesson on American history. That word find is testing to see if the students, or assessing to see if students can find given words in a box full of letters. Okay, so that's why it's important to look at students' current work and weigh that against the expectations that are needed to meet the state standards at a minimum, but beyond that, national standards, national tests, state tests, and so forth. And then finally, look at related literature and best practices. Once you do your needs assessment, you're going to finally align your curriculum. After a needs assessment, curriculum alignment shows what will be taught in all subject areas and at each grade level. This will involve curriculum mapping. This is a scope and sequence of when skills will be taught. Many of you may have curriculum maps in your districts. Curriculum benchmarking, we see this a little bit less because of the negative connotation that assessment has. But honestly, if you're teaching third grade reading and you know the students have to pass that test at the end of the year, benchmarking based upon that assessment shows the progress toward the goal. So if you're against showing that progress toward the goal, then my guess is that probably when your students get to the end, they're not very successful, because you have one shot at that point to get it right. You have no formative feedback to see if what you're doing in the classroom is teaching the students. Okay, so curriculum benchmarking then provides periodic assessment of the minimum standards of achievement. The curriculum audit helps identify strengths and gaps in instructional practices, and that is what I do a lot on my own. I actually perform curriculum audits in districts. That allows me to get into all kinds of districts and see the work that's happening and provide constructive feedback on how to help schools improve. And then finally, instructional differentiation attempts to determine which instructional methods are best for all learners. So once you get your needs assessment, then you're able to go through and start really looking at these things here. So the last thing, focusing on the vision and mission of the school, comes out to quality education. Okay. So the principal is the curriculum or instructional specialist or leader. So this is the instructional leader who has the understanding of philosophy, the clarity of vision, and the technical skills to move his or her programs toward meaningful activity. So we started out in the beginning talking about the importance of curriculum. We looked at the development of education in America, how it went from just schools to compulsory schools, and then finally the question of what to teach, what the purpose of schools was, and what we were going to teach to get to that purpose. And really over the last 100 years that has evolved tremendously, so that today we're looking at some of those much more complex definitions of curriculum, and we see that curriculum involves so much more than just the state standards. And it's the job of the principal to bring everybody together at the table and continuously work and improve upon the district curriculum. So with that, in the next presentation, we're going to continue talking a little bit about the principal as the instructional leader and working with the curriculum, because again, this is so important that all the other stuff, when we move into things like professional development, now if we have curriculum in place, or at least a target, we have something we can aim our professional development at when we're planning that. So for now, thank you, and in the next presentation we'll pick up here with instructional leader where we left off.